Hello folks, this is the third or fourth tutorial among the few that I'm doing. I'm not sure exactly what the number is at this point, but today we're going to be talking about functions and how to declare your own functions. Basically, when you create a plugin, you are solving a problem, right? Your goal is to, as a programmer, break up that problem into a whole bunch of small manageable tasks, right? So let's say we're going to do a calculator. Okay. Now this isn't very useful for players. They don't need this, but this is really good to come up with these little projects that you can do just to build your skills as developers. We're going to be creating a command, right? So players can do this. They can do sm add, right, and then supply two numbers. Now, these two numbers, we will add them and print out the result. Now this isn't, like I said, this doesn't do anything other than just teach you how to program better. So yeah, let's get started. So just like before, we're going to register a console command, right? For sm add, right? We're going to name it command add, and it's going to add two numbers, right? So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So we have our client, and then we have our arguments. Now, I didn't talk about this in the other video, but because SourceMod calls this function for us, right? They give us these parameters. We don't get to choose what these are. It wasn't very obvious before, but the first parameter is always the client, and the second parameter is always the arguments. It doesn't really matter what you name these, because these are just to help you, right? They're just to help you know what they are. But the first parameter is always the client, and then the second parameter is always the arguments. If you go into register console command in the API documentations that I've mentioned before, I'll put it in the description again. If you look at register console command and you look at the type that the second parameter is, it'll tell you that there's that the two parameters are integers, and it'll explain it a little bit, which is good. So if you have any questions about the API itself and how that works, the best place to go is the API documentation. Really, that's the gold mine for learning, and you should always do it. So, all right. So we're going to be taking two parameters, right? We're just going to limit it to two. So if arguments is not 2, then something went wrong, right? Something clearly is wrong here. So we're going to say if arguments does not equal 2, and I know the syntax seems a little interesting. If we wanted to check if it was 2, we would use double equal sign, but exclamation mark means not in terms of programming. So if args is not equal to 2, right? We're going to print. This should seem very familiar, right? We're going to reply to the command to the client, and we're going to say sm usage sm add number 1 number 2. Perfect. And then we're going to return plugin handled, because we don't want anything else to happen, right? Awesome. So now what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to get these arguments, right? So we're going to declare a string for the first argument, right? We'll just make it 32 characters, right? So we're going to get command argument. So we're going to get the first argument, and we're going to store it in arg1, and then we have to give the size of that buffer. So that's size of arg1. It's okay if this doesn't make much sense. In other languages, if you're familiar with them, you can just set strings equal to, in other languages, you might be able to do something like this, and then you wouldn't have these guys, but this is very C-like. If you've used C or C++ before, this shouldn't be too weird to you. But basically what you're doing is that you're giving it the first, you're giving it the character array, and then you're giving it the size of it. That way command arg knows the limit, right? So remember how we were talking about how in the last episode we were talking about how if you have how strings have a size and they have a certain amount of characters that they can hold. This basically just makes sure that it doesn't write too many too many characters or too many bytes into this. So it's a little complicated, but you don't have to worry about it too much. Just know that it's fairly important. So we're gonna get the first argument, right? And then we're gonna get the second argument. Get command arg, right? So we're getting the second argument, and we're storing this one in arg2, and then size of arg2. Perfect, right? Cool. And now we have to convert. If you notice, we have strings here that's going to contain the actual number. We need to convert this string to an integer. So there's little things for this. So we're going to convert the first one, right? And we're gonna allocate some memory for us. So this is number 1, right? And then we're going to do number 2 equal to string 2 int. We're going to get the second argument, right? So we're converting the character representation of the number to an actual integer. And this lets us do math, right? So now we can do some math on it. So instead of just doing num1 plus num2, instead of just doing math like that, let's declare a function. Let's have a little bit more fun on this. So we have this kind of big problem, right, where we have to add these numbers, and breaking it into small solutions is really good. So let's just make a little function. In reality, you wouldn't do this, but this is just showing you how to make functions, and it's pretty important. So we're going to say add two numbers, right? So we're going to have the first number, and then we're going to have the second number, right? Now what we're going to do is we are going to have a sum of these two numbers, right? Just by doing basic math here. And then we're going to return the value of sum. And now what that lets us do is we can use our little helper function here. That's exactly what this is called, the helper function. Sum equal to add two numbers. And we get to pass in number 1. And we get to pass in number 2. And boom, we have our sum, and we created our own little function here. And now we can output this sum. It can be a little tricky, I'm not gonna lie, to outputting numbers, outputting booleans, outputting floating point numbers, because there's this thing that we haven't covered yet called format specifiers. We'll talk about that in the next episode for sure. But it's basically a way to print out numbers in the form of a string, because just like when we had to convert from a string to an integer, we will have to convert back from integer to string. So if we use reply to command, right? If you notice in the function prototype, the third parameter is any ... This is for variadic arguments, and it's kind of like it's kind of a little bit complicated, but once you know how to use it, that's kind of the important part. So we're going to print the client, right? And we're going to tag it as SM, because obviously we're in SourceMod, and we're going to say your sum is, right? And here is where we'd want to put the number. We want to put the number here, and it doesn't really make much sense, but if you do %d, right? You're basically telling this function, you're saying, oh, hey, here's where I want to put this number. Like, I want to put the number right here. And you also need to give it that number, right? So what it's going to do is it's going to print out this string, but replace %d with this variable. And this should be it. This should work perfectly in game. You defined your own function, and creating your own little helper functions is super important. This one is kind of arbitrary. It's not necessary to have this. Good code wouldn't use a function for adding two numbers. In reality, you would do something like this, right? And then you wouldn't have this function. But having the function there just lets us kind of get comfortable using them, which is all we could ask for right now, is just knowing that you can declare your own functions. What I didn't talk about much was the form of int here. Basically, functions have a few tidbits, right? So they can be public, right? Meaning, what public means is that we don't call this function, right? We don't ever call command.add. We don't ever call onPluginStart, right? So what public does is it allows SourceMod to access that function, right? For in this example, it's not entirely necessary, but that's more of a quirk than anything else. But it's good to mark it public because it just makes it like very clear. But this one, for example, is not public because we don't want SourceMod to touch this function. It's ours. We made it for us, right? So we're not going to mark it public. The next part that always needs to be there is the return value, right? Just like how plugin handled is an action, right? Sum is an integer, so we need to say that we're returning an integer. And that way, when we hit say return sum, we can store it in an integer named sum, right? This doesn't have to be the same name. This can be whatever, but it's just easier this way. But yeah, so we're returning the integer, and so this is the return type, right? This could be void, and we wouldn't have to return, right? But then we can't get this number out, right? So see how we have this sum value? If this was void, meaning that there's no return, just like in onPluginStart, then we can't get this number back out. So by declaring it an integer, by having the return type be an integer, we can return what like the little math that we did, and then use it outside of here. And that's the same thing string to int does, really. It just does some crunching, grabs the number from the string, and then returns that integer, and then you get to use it, right? So we're just doing the same thing with add two numbers, and we get our sum. Let me just make sure that this compiles. It says command.add should return a value, which is very true. Do you remember how earlier I was talking about it always needs to return plugin handled? Perfect. So now we return plugin handled, saying that we handled whatever needed to be done, and this compiles. So what this will do is when you type smadd and then the two numbers, it will go ahead and spit you out the sum of those two numbers. Really cool, right? So this is kind of your first little math that you've done. It's a good amount of it's good coverage here. We talked about a little bit about return types, and we were able to declare our own parameters here. We were able to do whatever we wanted. We can make this work with floats and stuff too if we wanted. But yeah, that's basically it. I hope you guys learned something. I hope this was a little bit helpful. If you have any questions, comment below about what your question is, and I'll do my best to answer it. So thank you very much. I hope you guys have a good rest of the day, and good luck coding in the future.